the Middle East, and a week of drama and tension comes to an explosive end. This was the scene at the Zaka airstrip in Jordan recently, when the massive pall of smoke from 3 blazing airliners told a world which needed no reminding that the Palestinian guerrillas meant business. The planes had all been hijacked by the guerrillas a week earlier. First victim was a Boeing 707 from America's Trans World Airways, then a Swiss Air DC-8, another 707 from Israel's El Al airline, all with 155 occupants, and a Pan-American jumbo jet carrying 170. All the hijackings were successful except this one, the El Al Boeing, which was flying from Amsterdam to New York. As the plane flew over England's east coast, 2 Arabs, a man and a girl, pulled out grenades and tried to force the captain to change course. In the struggle which ensued, the man was killed and the girl taken prisoner. The plane eventually landed at London's Heathrow Airport, where the girl was held for questioning. Back in Tel Aviv, Captain Uri Bar-Lev explained what had happened.
I pulled the airplane into a steep dive, handed control to the first officer, and told him to go toward London Airport, and I myself jumped out to the cabin. When I jumped out, I saw a man, which apparently was the hijacker, laying on the floor. I couldn't even open the door. I had to push it in order to open. Behind him are men, Shlomo Vider, a steward, lying as well. And further, in the first class, on the right-hand side, a woman, which looked like Arab. On top of her, our purser, Abraham Eisenberg, and on top of him, some other people.
Responsibility for the hijackings was claimed by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a relatively small organization with strong Marxist leanings. The group claimed the hijackings were intended to disrupt the Middle East peace talks. The fanatical devotion of the PFLP's followers is well exemplified in Leila Khaled, the girl involved in the unsuccessful attempt on the El Al plane. A year ago, she took part in a similar but successful hijacking of a TWA 707. On that occasion, the plane was diverted to Damascus, where it was blown up. Afterwards, she was asked why she'd done it.
By hijacking that plane, we can tell those people that there's a war, there's a cause here in the Middle East, so just not come here.
Now you are continuing to fight for that cause and fighting that war.
Yes.
How far ahead do you see the possibility of victory in your fight for Palestine?
As long as we have our clear vision of the revolution, I can say that we will have victory at the end.
In how many years do you think this end might be?
We can't say in how many years. It would take us a long, long time. And we can't say maybe for 50 years.
Whilst Leila Khaled was being held in London, the other hijacked teams were heading their captured planes towards destinations in the Middle East. 2 of them, the Swiss Air DC-8 and the Trans World 707, arrived here at a lonely airfield which the guerrillas called the Revolution Airstrip. The airstrip was near Zaka, some 20 miles northeast of Amman in Jordan. Its official name is Dawson'S Field, after the British Air Marshal who ordered its construction in 1947. The airstrip, which is used only for emergency landings, is little more than a strip of sand and gravel in the midst of the desert. But for the 300 or so occupants of the 2 planes, it was terra firma and heartily welcome after the perilous hours they'd just spent in the air. When daylight came, over 120 of the passengers, mostly women and children, were allowed to leave the plane to be escorted under heavy guard to Amman, but their passports were retained by the Palestinians. In Amman, the passengers were booked in at the Intercontinental Hotel, where they had the chance for the first time in many hours to sit back for a moment and collect their thoughts. It wasn't long before they were telling their story to the press.
There was a tremendous bounce, and of course the brakes pulling on, and a force as if we were going to really crash land, and then suddenly the plane filled with sand, which we thought was fire, and everybody ran in all directions.
Were any threats made to you at all on the plane of what might happen to you?
No, none at all. None that we heard of whatsoever.
How did you find the Palestine commanders once you'd landed? What was their attitude towards you?
They were very pleasant, extremely helpful, very cordial, and very nice. And they loved the children, which was something that everybody noticed.
But did they threaten at any stage to blow up the plane?
Never, no. Never, never. They never threatened us at all in any way.
Meanwhile, an indication that the guerrillas were men of action rather than words was provided by the fate of the fourth plane, Pan America's 747 jumbo jet. After being diverted to Beirut, where it was refueled, the jumbo was forced to fly to Cairo, where its passengers and crew were taken off. Minutes later, the plane was blown up. The explosion produced a violent international reaction. Even the Arab world was divided in its praise and blame. The hijackers, apparently there were 3 of them, were held by the Cairo police for interrogation. The destruction of the jumbo cost Pan American, or at least their insurers, $24 million. The irony is that the intended victim was not Pan American at all. The hijackers had originally booked on El Al, but officials of the Israeli airline became suspicious. In the end, Pan American accepted the booking, but made special checks on the men both before and after they boarded the plane. Incredibly, their concealed weapons were never discovered. The jumbo's passengers fared comparatively well. On the day following the explosion, all of them flew to Rome before making their way thankfully homewards. A few of the passengers had been injured in the scramble for safety before the plane blew up, but none of them were seriously hurt. One thing all were sure of is that they'd been in the hands of determined and highly trained men.
They wired it, and it was funny that we didn't even realize when they were wiring it. They were so combative. They knew what they were doing. We did not realize when they wired it. It was all throughout the airplane. It was from the cockpit all the way to the tail of the airplane. Because when the airplane flew, it flew in sections. It started in the lounge, and it moved back, all the way back, section to section. So we really didn't. We didn't realize what they were doing.
You went out in about 3 minutes.
I think it was a lot less than that.
Yes.
They had given us 8 minutes to get out.
8 minutes, and it was already, I don't know, how did they put fire on or how?
It was dynamite, and they lit the fuses before we got off the airplane. They knew how long the fuses were going to take. The lounge was the first place to go, and then it moved back through the airplane.
That was the most terrible moment, I suppose.
Well, no, we were all out of the airplane, and we were all running, and we all heard the first blast.
They said, now you have to go out. And
well, we knew that we were going to have to go. They had told us a half an hour. They gave us a half an hour warning, and they said, you're going to evacuate. And we explained to the passengers, and everybody was calm, and everybody got out, and they ran from the airplane as fast as they could go.
But for every released passenger, there was another for whom the nightmare had not yet ended. Back at Dawson'S field, the remaining hostages were still sweating it out, sweating being the operative word in a spot where the daytime temperature often exceeds 40 degrees centigrade. The atmosphere was, in fact, remarkably relaxed, especially in view of the 72-hour ultimatum which the guerrillas had issued: meet our demands or we'll blow up both planes and passengers. Around the planes was a heavy guard made up not only of Palestinian guerrillas but of Jordanian regular forces. Meanwhile, the guerrillas were adding yet another hijacked airliner to their rapidly expanding collection. This time, a VC-10 jet of the British Overseas Airways Corporation. The plane, which was flying from Bahrain to London, was forced down for refuelling at Beirut Airport, where guerrillas had taken over the control tower. After a 2-hour stop, the plane was then forced to fly on to Jordan to join the other two at Dawson'S field. By this time, the desert airstrip was beginning to look more like a regular airport. In this one small, well-defended spot, the guerrillas held aircraft worth about £10 million and nearly 200 hostages. The first ultimatum had already run out, but had been replaced by another one couched in exactly the same uncompromising terms. About half the VC-10 passengers were British, with Arabs and Indians making up most of the remainder. More than 30 children were on board the plane. Here, too, morale was remarkably high considering the circumstances. The worst moment had been during refueling at Beirut, where both the passengers and the Lebanese ground crews had been warned that any refusal to obey would result in the destruction of the plane with the passengers inside it. The plane's commander was Captain Cyril Goulbourne.
Was there any doubt in your mind that you would in fact fly where he told you to?
I don't think there's any doubt of flying where he told you, no. The whole point is that you've got a gun at your neck and you've got to fly the aeroplane. He's got presumably lethal devices apart from the gun. He told us he had. And he said if it didn't do as we didn't do as he wanted us to do, it just blows a lot up.
Is there dynamite on the plane that you know of?
I rather think there is.
Have they threatened to blow you up?
No, they haven't mentioned anything at all about that whatsoever. They have told us very little, other than that things will be all right. They told us we will get lunch, dinner and tea today. Oh, breakfast, lunch and dinner. But it's getting a bit short of time now.
And you're feeling tired?
Well, it's not the ideal conditions. I'm surprised how everybody's standing up to it.
How are they treating you?
Well, they're polite, but if you ask questions, they don't like it.
What are you doing during the day inside the aircraft?
Well, you read and just do a puzzle or two.
Are you frightened?
No, I'm not frightened.
People
are frightened now. I don't know, I haven't heard from my parents. They've probably been notified.
If you want us to continue this press conference, please keep away from there.
At one point, the press conference began to get a little out of hand, with the journalists crowding much too near for the guerrillas' liking.
Keep away, please. You see, unless you keep away from here, or all the passengers will be up again.
Over in Amman, things were far from quiet. The permanent feud between the guerrillas and the Jordanian regular forces broke out into open warfare. The area around the Intercontinental Hotel where the hijacked passengers were being held was one of the main centers of the fighting. The passengers spent the expiring hours of the first ultimatum in the hotel basement as the Jordanians and Palestinians fought it out above their heads. Another guest in Amman was André Rochard, one of the chief Middle East negotiators for the International Red Cross. He and his colleagues had already spent many grueling hours bargaining with the Palestinians' leaders over the fate of the remaining hostages. As the battle raged and the negotiators talked, there was little the passengers could do but wait and hope that somehow they would be rescued from a plane trip which had turned into a nightmare.
All reporters, please leave the hall. All reporters, please leave the hall.
At last, the passports arrived, or some of them at least. Many passengers were able to leave Amman for Cyprus, where they picked up flights home or awaited the release of relatives still held in Jordan. Reaction to the hijackings was worldwide, and at the United Nations, the Security Council called for the release of all hostages. Secretary General U Thant had this to say.
However understandable and even justifiable some of the grievances of the perpetrators may be, their acts are savage and inhuman. That's what I said. I'm glad that the Security Council only yesterday took the first step, which I hope will generate further international action to put a stop to this return to the law of the jungle. I'm horrified by the sudden increase in the number of incidents involving innocent international air travelers whose safety and lives are being ruthlessly endangered.
In spite of this, the UN Secretary-General was roundly criticized by Israel's Prime Minister, Mrs. Golda Meir, for failing to support decisive action against the hijackers, both now and in the past. In Israel as a whole, the sense of outrage against the hijackings was especially high, but Israeli youths had their own ideas about how the hijack threat should be dealt with.
In El Al, they took the necessary precautions and had armed guards, and the people resisted the hijackings. On the TWA and Pan Am and Swiss Air, this did not occur, and therefore we have the situation that exists now.
Yes, what do you think the governments concerned, Britain, Israel, and the other three, should now do?
And further should act together and put pressure, not give up, and put pressure on the Arab governments.
What pressure can they put?
If they not give up, I don't think the Arab guerrillas do what they are telling they do.
You think they're bluffing?
Yes, I think they play with the ball.
Meanwhile, the guerrillas' second ultimatum was reaching its final stage, and at Dawson'S field, the situation was getting worse, not better. Six days in the desert were beginning to take their toll. Although food, water, and medical care were all provided by the guerrillas, life in the aircraft was becoming distinctly unpleasant. Toilet facilities, for example, had long since become unhygienic, a situation which was not helped by the fierce desert heat. About half of the hostages were women and children. As the deadline approached, they were moved away, leaving only the men and their guerrilla guards. The fate of the hostages hung in the balance for 4 agonizing hours, and then at last the order came for the men too to be taken off and escorted to Amman. Although the passengers were spared, the planes were not. This was how cameraman Haji Dalal recorded the scene from a distance of only 300 yards. The VC-10 was the first to go. The next was the TWA Boeing. The Swiss plane wouldn't go up at first, and the guerrillas had to approach the blazing planes and fire shots into it before the dynamite exploded. The entry into Amman was something of an occasion. 10 million pounds worth of aircraft might be burning out in the desert, but for the moment at least, the hostages were safe and sound. Oddly enough, the guerrillas seemed to share in the general feeling of rejoicing, and at the head of the convoy, a Popular Front commando sang the revolutionary anthem. As the passengers left the camouflaged trucks supplied by the Royal Jordanian Army, they pushed their way through a barrage of soldiers, press and friends into the Intercontinental Hotel, where over 400 people waited to receive them. The passengers' arrival meant that anxious mothers could at last give their small babies a decent feed, their first in nearly a week.
Thank you, sir. What was the worst part of it?
Oh, actually coming to the place. And when they took all our bags off, we thought they were going to blow the thing up. We were very scared then.
You really thought that? And what did you do?
We just sat there.
Mrs. Leslie Cook is a nurse who was in charge of 24 children on the VC-10. How did they react to the crisis?
During the 3 days? They were very good. They were marvellous, actually. We really got them trained with coming up for their water and everything and sitting down in their blankets and their pillows. They never committed the greatest sin of losing their water cup, which the adults did frequently.
How did you go about amusing them?
Well, there were comics and magazines, and there's plenty of games that BOC provide on the aircraft anyway. And that was it, really.
And what about the commandos? What sort of relations did the children have with the...
Very, very good. Very good. They used to sit by the exits, and the children used to go up and sit beside them and try and talk to them, because most of them speak a little English.
And the commandos, did they seem friendly towards the children?
Yes. Yes. I don't think they meant us any harm personally. They just wanted what they want, and we'd have to take the consequences if they didn't get it.
Do you think they would have been prepared to blow up the plane with the children on board?
Yes, quite definitely, yes.
Were you ever afraid that you wouldn't make it?
Yes, all the time I was there. Because we knew that we saw the men putting charges into the planes 4 or 5 days ago. We thought they were going to blow them up with us any day. We knew the planes were loaded.
And I suppose it's not even necessary to ask if you were happy to have him back.
I don't know.
After all the strain of 6 days in captivity, at last a moment to relax and celebrate the deliverance. But the relief was mixed with concern for those still in the guerrillas' hands.
Can you just explain to us what the situation is now?
ايش بدك تقول ايش الحاله الان موجوده يعني
الحاله
ايش الوضع يعني
احنا مش عايزين مشاكل يعني احنا عايزين حقوقنا وبس
we want only our rights he says we want nothing else except our rights we want our prisoners back and all the women and children have been released unconditionally
they can go home now if they wish
اذا بدهم النسوان والأولاد يروحوا بيقدروا يتركوا عليه
بيقدروا
they can
What happens to the men aboard the aircraft?
The men are being kept as hostages until our prisoners are released.
Later in the day, at a PFLP press conference, we asked a spokesman what would happen to the remaining hostages if the guerrillas' demands were not met.
They will be kept as prisoners of war.
Indefinitely?
As long as we don't get what we want.
So there will be no reprisals against these 40 hostages?
By whom?
By... during the time they are in Jordan?
We do not reprise against anybody. We will treat them very kindly.
The question everybody wanted answered was whether the worldwide condemnation of the Popular Front's actions would lead them to abandon their policy of hijacking Western aircraft. We put this to Mr. Ghazan Kanafani, a PFLP spokesman in Beirut.
Attacking the communications of our enemy is part of our fight. And the whole world is your enemy? Not the whole world, the whole imperialism. But presumably Germany, Switzerland,
Britain?
Of course, they are imperialism. And they are under the pressure of the leader imperialism, the American imperialism, taking many positions against our people.
So can the airlines of Western Europe look forward to further hijackings in the future?
So I said, attacking the communications of our enemies is a kind of our fight, a part of our fighting. We are not fighting only in this part, but this is a part of our fighting. We will stop it when we stop fighting. And there is two ways we stop fighting. Either we finish at all, or we achieve our victory.
The saga of Dawson's Field is over, but nobody believes the hijack story will stop there. The PFLP contains people who believe virtually any action is justifiable if, in their eyes, it advances the cause of Palestinian nationalism. It's just possible that Dawson's Field may prove to be not an end, but a beginning.